Welcome to VBA Modeling for Supply Chain Planning and Financial Analysis. Here we will teach you how to write your own VBA code within Excel. This will be presented to you by Supply Chain Systems of Miami, Florida. Please contact us if you would like us to build models for you, or if you'd like to learn more about building the models for yourself. I hope you enjoy the tutorials, and please follow the link in the video description to get your own copy of the VBA code that is presented here. In Lesson 5, we are going to explore two major concepts. One is more of an operational thing, and the other one is as far as the structure of a new capability within VBA and Excel generally. In the first one, let's just describe what we're going to be doing here. We have a complicated set of looping that's going to occur here, and we want to be able to test it. And there's, I think we described in a very early session here, that there's such a thing as a break mode, and we can actually move our cursor along this gray edge here and pick a line and just click, left mouse click. And you can see what happens here is that it'll put a little dot over in the in that gray panel, and then red line all of the line or the code that's there. And what this is actually implementing a break mode, where if you were to try to operate, let's just give you a little demonstration here. We can actually, our cursor is at the very beginning here. If we hit the F8 key, it'll turn yellow and it'll show that we're at the very beginning of the code. But now if we were to actually hit the arrow, which is just run the entire set of code that's there, you'll see what happens. Boom. It executes all of the code up from the beginning or wherever the code was at the time to the breakpoint that you just initiated. You can put in multiple breakpoints if you so desire. Let's say we want to put another one down here on this line where it says next K. We can put another one over there, and if we were to hit the run button again, or the continue button, you can see it will execute all of the code up to that point. So break modes is very handy for debugging your code and allowing you to, if you debugged your code up to a certain point, you can then execute the code very quickly without stepping through it like we have been doing with the F8 key. In order to get rid of these breakpoints, all you have to do is reverse the process by clicking on your dots again, and it'll get rid of them. And I'll do it up here again, and now it will just continue on from that point on. If we want to continue with F8, we can use that. Or if we want to use the continue button again, or the F5 key on your keyboard, it will allow you to then do that as well. So let's just go ahead and hit the continue and see what happens over here, especially to our left panel. You can see it's actually looping through this code, and every time I hit this button, it's writing a new line in our spreadsheet on the worksheet main. So operationally, that's what's happening here, and it'll continue to operate until the conditions of the code are completely met. And let's just continue this, and there it goes. Now we're all done. So that's the concept of using break mode as a debugging tool. And you can check your values up to the breakpoint of what actually has been executed. You can hover over the values like we've talked about in the past and see what those values are. Or you can stop your code at any point here and see what was actually executed and transpired as on your spreadsheet. Alright, going back to the code itself, in this particular lesson, as far as the structure, we're talking about really two major concepts here. The first one is an array, and the second one is the idea of having nested code or sections of code that are within loops. So let's talk about arrays first, and then we can get into this concept of nesting. Alright, starting at the top here, we have a new type of dimension statement where we're actually going to define an array. This is an arbitrary name. I called it my array, but in parentheses we can do one of two things here. In this one I chose to actually show a range for each of the variables that are going to be defined. And because the way I've done it here, you can see that there's 2 commas, and so we actually have a 3-level or a 3-dimension array that we're defining up here. And we're saying the size of the box. That's what an array basically is. Especially when I'm defining 3 dimensions. We have an X, a Y, and a Z plane, and we're actually giving coordinates to where the information is. So think of an array like a storage box, and we're actually defining exactly where in this box we are putting things. So that's what's happening here, and we're saying that we're numbering the different cells or the different locations within a box. And so this is a 10 by 10 by 10 box, and every time we write something, we're writing into these different coordinates within that box. Okay, in order to be able to go the next step further, we're going to actually dimension for ourselves 3 variables, an I, a J, and a K. Since these are locations and we're going to iterate through these things, they're just counters in essence, we're going to use the integer data type for each one of those. And then finally, when we're actually writing to the rows, the output on the side, we're going to dimension a row number by saying iRow as integer as well. Again, another counting type of a variable is being defined here. Alright, let's execute this one step at a time to see what happens. Alright, so we go down to the first line after the dimension statement, and it says sheet main range A to C. Alright, so this is looking at the columns A to C, and we're going to clear those out. Alright, hit the F8 key, and bam, it's all cleaned up. So this is our starting point. We've basically initialized and prepared the worksheet for the information we're going to put in there. And we're not going to worry about having remnants of old data that's sitting there. So we did a massive cleanup of this with this particular statement. Alright, the next thing we're going to do is just for simplicity purposes, we're going to write a header, and in A1 we're going to put in array values. So hit the F8 key, and it writes in a header for that. And as I think we mentioned in a previous lesson here, we're going to do some formatting of that particular cell, A1, same cell, and we're going to say font bold true, separated by periods there, and hit the F8, and basically we bolded that particular cell. Alright, now let's look at this kind of in total here. We have an initialization of iRow is equal to 2. So if we were going to be looking at this location here where we want to start or initialize our writing, that's going to be our first storage location. And we can increment this down the road. Alright, let's execute that and go on to the first part of our nested do loop, or our nested loops that we have here. Alright, we've initialized it, and notice that we have some things that look like they're constructed together. We have the for up here for I, 1 to 5, and down here we have a corresponding next I. So when we do a for next loop for accounting purposes, it's always going to look like that, where we're going to have a for statement and a next statement, and then everything in the middle is going to be executed with the number of iterations that we see in the rest of this construct here. So we're saying that the first I value is going to be 1, and it's going to keep on incrementing to 5. In other words, there'll be 5 iterations of going through this particular part of the code. So everything in the middle is going to be done 5 times. Then we have another one that's inside of this. We see that we're going to define J, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to go from 1 to 5, and there's a next J statement also here that corresponds to this. So within the loop, we're going to have I is going to be incremented 5 times, but every time I is incremented, we have another 5 iterations that we're going to go through for J. And similarly, inside of J, we're going to do the same thing again. We're going to say K is equal to 1 to 5, and here we have a corresponding next K. So we're going to iterate again inside of that. So you can just imagine how many iterations we're going through this thing. We're doing, it's like a power of 3 that we're doing as far as the number of iterations that are going on here. And then inside of this, we have some conditional logic. We have some mathematics that's occurring. We're going to have a message box is going to pop up and have some information in it. And we're going to store some values into different storage locations. And we're also going to write those to the cells that are going to be on this spreadsheet over here. So let's just step through this manually one at a time. You can see it's fairly cumbersome. And watch how this is operating here. So I'm going to hit the F8 key slowly so you can watch how this executes. Alright, first line, second line, third line, goes through, evaluates all of these things. And if you look at this particular logic that is here, it skipped over a lot of this information because it says that if I is equal to 3 and K is equal to 2, or I is greater than 4, then it's going to execute this. It actually skipped over that because this is not true yet. If you remember, we initialized J as 1, so this is false. If we look at K, K is also still 1. So we can hover over and see what those values are there. See, this is all false. Both of these conditions are false. We can go on to the next one and say, what's I? Well, I is equal to 1, but the condition over here that it's looking for is I greater than 4? Well, guess what? That's still false too. So we have 2 parts of the conditional logic, and both of them are false. Therefore, this part does not execute. So we're not going to be able to actually execute this part until we go through the code multiple times before we get to this point. So if we kept on hitting the F8 key, watch the way this thing is going. So it's going to execute through here at least 5 times. So it keeps on skipping the code. It's not satisfying any of these conditions. I obviously is not changing. It's staying at 1 this whole time. Let's just hover over it. Let's see what J is now. J is at 3. That's equal to this now. That part is true. And what is K at this point? K is equal to 5. That's not true. Alright, so let's keep on going here. Everything is still false. We keep on iterating through. So you can see I'm doing this the slow way right now, executing 1 line of code at a time. Finally, the message box popped up, which means that some of this conditional logic has now been executed and is true. So let's look at what J is here. Well, I think we have to I'm going to have to put a breakpoint in, I think, in order to be able to look at this. Whoops, let's do this. There we go. Okay. So let's see what our values are that made this true. J is equal to 3, that's true. K is equal to 2, that is true. So already we know that this is going to execute. Is I greater than 4 yet? No, we still haven't gone through the outer part of this loop yet. We're still in this intersection where K is iterating and J is iterating until both of them equal 5. So we have not done that yet, but the message box is going to pop up because of that. The logic is turning true on this part of the conditional logic, not on this part. All right, so let's look at this one more time. Let's execute until the box pops up. All very slow. A lot of the logic is still not true. So this is a very unique case when J is equal to 3 and K is equal to 2. Actually, this is probably not going to execute again because there's only one time that those two things are going to be those values. These are incrementing numbers all the time, and there's a combination of that it's only going to be true maybe one time out of each time that I is going to iterate. So let's keep going here. Now, obviously, this is a very slow way of debugging this thing. Let's see where I is up to at this point. I is still equal to 1. Let's put a breakpoint in this right at K. So now we don't have to actually hit so many F8 keys. We're going to use our breakpoint to analyze this thing. All right, we executed incrementation of K once here. Let's see what K is. K is still 2. J is equal to 5. Still nothing. 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 I'm waiting to see when that box comes up. Ah, there we go. Now we're finally up to a point, as I was saying. We have I is equal to 2, so this is the outer loop. We finally incremented that once. Now we have that condition again where J is equal to 3 and K is equal to 2. So this condition is now being satisfied, and it's one of our two conditions that have to be true before this bit of code over here executes. If I hit the OK, now we're back to where we were. Now we don't even really need the breakpoint at this point. Let's go ahead. The message box is going to stop our code, and it's going to go through it one at a time. Let's get rid of the breakpoint here. And now let's just execute the code here. And it's actually stopping right at this particular part here because the message box is really stopping the code until you acknowledge it with the OK button. But let's look at where we are now. I is equal to 3, and we have that same condition again. We still haven't gone past I equals 4. So every time I iterates, there is that set of conditions where J is equal to 3 and K is equal to 2. So that means that only one time per outer increment will this condition be true, out of 5 each time. All right, notice I incremented up again, and it obviously went through a lot of other iterations before it got to that point. But now I is equal to 4, J is equal to 3, and K is equal to 2. That same condition is causing this to happen. But we have not exceeded the value of 4. This is the last case where the value is now 4 for I. Let's do it one more time and watch. This is completely different. Now I is greater than 4. And it doesn't matter what these conditions are since there was OR logic here. And notice that we're writing these statements out to the spreadsheet on every one of those. So when I hit this, now it's incrementing and writing each time. So there's almost not a case now, matter of fact, there is not a case now where at least one of these conditions is actually causing the logic of this to turn true and to print out our information to the spreadsheet, or write it out to the spreadsheet. So if we look at the number sets here, the thing that was causing this statement to be true was only when these two conditions were satisfied. Then we finally got up to when I is equal to 5, and we can see that j and k, every instance, we go k equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now j incremented, and it's k, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and this will continue. You can see that same pattern occurring here. So k is incrementing every time, but every time that j increments, it really doesn't matter for the conditional logic because I is already above 4, and it's making that statement true. So it's a little grueling to follow through this, but you can see how the nesting works on this thing, and it's a very powerful way of doing things many times and actually writing to a very large data set if you want to store this information. And then you could pull it out in the same way by going back to that storage location, either examining it or having some conditional logic on it. It could be forecasts. It could be how much sales in a particular region. It could be sales by region by salesperson. You can see that we're always talking in terms of data sets that have different dimensions to that information. We may not care about who sold the product or where it was sold, but it may be by customer. And I want to know a certain product by customer, okay, by time period. That would be another three-dimensional situation, and we would want to store our information accordingly and be able to retrieve it as we needed to. But in supply chain, this is very, very common to have multiple dimensions to your information, and you need to be able to store it, you need to be able to analyze it, and be able to retrieve it as needed. And so this is an illustration with this little code here, is showing all the different ways that you would handle this particular situation. Alright, we just do this a few more times, and finally the code is done and this particular subroutine is finished. Thank you for your time, and I hope you see the power of this particular type of setup with arrays and how you would write it.